My MIL walked out of my baby shower when the gender reveal showed pink and said she'd come back when I had a real grandchild. She'd invited 70 people to the country club, hired photographers, ordered custom decorations. "This will be the event of the year," she kept saying, "when everyone finds out about my grandson." She was convinced it was a boy, bought blue decorations, just in case we need them later. Told her friends at church to prepare for a little man. Even embroidered a blanket with Junior on it. My husband Jack and I didn't know the gender. We'd had the doctor write it down, sealed it in an envelope, and given it directly to the baker. Eleanor tried to steam open that envelope twice before I caught her. "I just want to prepare properly," she said. "That's what the reveal is for," I reminded her. She'd already decorated the country club in yellows and greens, but I saw the box of blue streamers in her car, ready to deploy the second she got confirmation of her grandson. The shower started beautifully. Everyone gathered, gifts piled high, my 2-year-old daughter Lucy running around in her big sister dress. Eleanor kept picking Lucy up and saying, "Soon you'll have a brother to protect you." "What if it's a sister?" Jack asked. "Don't be silly," Eleanor said. "I prayed specifically for a boy." The cake moment arrived. Eleanor pushed to the front, phone ready, practically vibrating with excitement. "Everyone watch! This is history! The first grandson!" Jack and I cut into the cake together. Pink filling spilled out. Bright, undeniable, perfect pink. The room erupted in cheers. "Another girl! Sisters! How wonderful!" But Eleanor stood frozen, staring at the pink cake like it had personally betrayed her. "There must be a mistake," she said loudly. "Cut another piece." We cut another piece, still pink. "The baker got it wrong," she insisted. "No, Eleanor," I said. "We're having a girl." She set down her phone, picked up her purse, started walking toward the door. "Mom, where are you going?" Jack called. "I need air." "The party just started. We haven't even opened gifts." "I'm not feeling well." "Mom, stop." She turned at the door. The entire room was watching. "This is false advertising," she said. "I planned this shower for my first grandchild. My real grandchild, not another girl." "Another girl?" I said. "Lucy is your grandchild. This baby is your grandchild." "You know what I mean. A legacy child. Someone to carry on the family name. This." She gestured at the pink cake. "This is just redundancy." My grandmother stood up. "Eleanor, you're being ridiculous." "I'm being practical. 2 girls? What's the point? They'll just marry off, become other people's families. Boys stay, boys matter." "That's enough," Jack said. "Leave if you're going to leave." "I will. Call me when you have something worth celebrating." She walked out. The room stayed silent for a moment. Then my sister Amy said loudly, "Good riddance. More cake for people who actually love this baby." The party continued without her. Better without her. People shared stories about sisters, about growing up as girls, about strong women they knew. Lucy ate pink cake until her whole face was covered. Jack's Aunt Helen gave a speech about how Eleanor had clearly forgotten she was one of 3 girls herself. "Our mother loved us exactly as we were," Helen said. "Shame Eleanor can't do the same." Eleanor didn't call for a week. When she finally did, it was to ask if we'd considered trying again for a boy. "Trying again?" "I'm still pregnant with this one," I said. "I mean after. You're young. You could have several more attempts." "Attempts? These are children, not lottery tickets." "You know what I mean. Chances for a boy." "We're having 2 daughters. That's our family." "That's Jack's failure, you mean? The man determines the gender." "That's not a failure. That's genetics." "Its disappointment is what it is. I'll never have a grandson." "Then you'll never see your granddaughters." "Don't be dramatic. I'll see them at holidays." "Not if you keep calling them disappointments." She hung up on me, told the entire family I was keeping her grandchildren from her. But Helen set everyone straight. "She walked out of a baby shower because of pink cake," Helen told them. "What kind of grandmother does that?" We had our daughter 2 months later, named her Rose, because she's perfect and pink, and everything Eleanor said wasn't worth celebrating. Eleanor sent a card with no money, just a note. "I am amending my will, removing both girls as beneficiaries." That note sat on my kitchen counter for 2 days because I couldn't bring myself to throw it away or file it somewhere. My phone started ringing that same evening. First, my mom Octavia called, her voice shaking with anger as she asked if I'd seen what Eleanor sent. She kept saying she'd never witnessed anything so cruel in her entire life, that Eleanor had crossed a line that couldn't be uncrossed. Then my grandmother Caroline called, and she didn't even ask about the note. She just launched into calling Eleanor that ungrateful woman, over and over. The weird part was hearing Caroline talk that way about someone she'd known for 30 years, someone she'd shared holidays and birthdays with, someone she'd welcomed into our family when Jack and I got married. The next morning brought more calls. Jack's Aunt Helen, my sister Amy, even some cousins I barely talked to who'd been at the shower. Everyone wanted to know if the will thing was real, if Eleanor had actually put it in writing. I found myself repeating the same story over and over, reading Eleanor's exact words aloud until they lost all meaning and just became sounds. Jack spent those days trying to call his mother. I'd hear him in the other room, phone pressed to his ear, waiting through ring after ring. She never picked up. He'd leave messages asking her to call back, to explain herself, to just talk to him. Nothing. On the third day, his dad Sebastian answered Eleanor's phone. I was in the kitchen making lunch when I heard Jack's voice change, going from tired to angry in seconds. Sebastian told him Eleanor was too upset to talk, that she needed time to process her disappointment. Jack's face went red and he hung up without saying goodbye, something I'd never seen him do to his father before. He threw his phone on the couch and walked outside, stood in the backyard with his hands on his head like he was trying to hold himself together. Lucy kept asking where Grandma Eleanor went. She'd toddle up to me with her little confused face and want to know why Gamma left the party so fast, why she didn't say goodbye when she was coming back. I tried telling her Grandma wasn't feeling well, that sometimes grown-ups get sick and need to go home. Lucy looked at me with those knowing 2-year-old eyes and said very clearly that Gamma was mad about baby sister. My heart just broke right there in the living room. Even a toddler could see the rejection, could understand that her grandmother had walked out because of the baby's gender. I picked Lucy up and held her tight, trying to figure out what to say that wouldn't damage her but also wouldn't be a lie. Jack came in and took over, distracting her with a snack and a cartoon. But later that night when she was asleep, he sat on the edge of our bed and cried. A week after the shower, Eleanor finally called Jack's phone. I was folding laundry when he answered, and I could hear her voice through the speaker even though he hadn't put it on speakerphone. She didn't apologize or ask how we were doing. She launched straight into a lecture about genetic testing and IVF with gender selection. She had clearly researched this, had statistics ready about success rates and clinic recommendations. Jack let her talk for maybe 2 minutes before he cut her off and told her this was insane. Eleanor's response came fast and sharp. She said his father's family name dying out was what was truly insane, that he was failing his duty as the only son, that we were being selfish by not taking advantage of modern medicine. Jack ended the call without responding and sat there staring at his phone like it had betrayed him. I spent the next few days trying to focus on preparing for Rose. The nursery needed to be set up. All those tiny pink clothes needed to be washed and folded. The changing table needed to be assembled. But Eleanor's words kept playing in my head on repeat. The idea that my daughters were somehow less valuable than sons we didn't have made me feel sick to my stomach. I'd be washing onesies and suddenly I'd remember her saying redundancy about having 2 girls, or I'd be putting together the crib and hear her voice saying real grandchild, like Lucy wasn't real, like Rose wouldn't be real either. Jack found me crying in the nursery more than once and he'd just hold me without saying anything because what was there to say? His mother had made it clear what she thought of our family, of our daughters, of us. Helen called one afternoon while I was sorting through baby blankets. Her voice was tight with anger as she told me Eleanor had been spreading stories at church. Apparently Eleanor was telling people I refused to try for a boy, that I was selfishly ending the family line, that I had some kind of agenda against male children. Helen said she was furious, that she'd already started setting the record straight with their church group, that she wouldn't let Eleanor rewrite history to make herself the victim. I thanked her and hung up feeling even worse because now Eleanor wasn't just rejecting our daughters privately, she was campaigning publicly against us. My sister Amy showed up 2 days later with Chinese takeout and found me sobbing in the nursery again. She didn't ask questions, just set down the food and wrapped her arms around me. She said Eleanor was showing her true colors now, that it was actually better we knew what kind of person she really was before Rose arrived and could be hurt too. Amy reminded me that Lucy was young enough that maybe she wouldn't remember this, that we could protect both girls from Eleanor's poison if we acted now. We ate lo mein sitting on the floor of the nursery, surrounded by pink blankets and stuffed animals, and Amy made me laugh by suggesting increasingly ridiculous ways to mess with Eleanor. 2 weeks after the shower, Jack got an email from his mother. A long, detailed email with the subject line, "Moving forward." I read it over his shoulder and felt my blood pressure spike with every paragraph. Eleanor had laid out her reasonable expectations for us to try for a boy within 2 years of Rose's birth. She'd included actual statistics about gender disappointment being a real medical condition. She'd attached links to 3 different fertility clinics that offered gender selection services, complete with pricing information and success rates. She'd even drafted a timeline suggesting we start the process when Rose turned 18 months old. The email was formatted like a business proposal, bullet points and action items. Jack stared at his screen for a long time before he started typing his response. His email back to Eleanor was short but brutal. He told her that her obsession with male grandchildren was disturbing and sexist. He pointed out that she herself was a daughter, that her own mother had 3 girls, and asked if Eleanor thought her mother had considered her worthless. He wrote that our family was complete with 2 daughters, that we weren't having more children to satisfy her weird legacy fantasies, and that she needed to examine why she valued male grandchildren over female ones. He hit send before I could read the whole thing, and then he closed his laptop and walked away. Eleanor's response came within an hour, but it wasn't to Jack. She called Sebastian crying, and Sebastian called Jack asking what he'd said to upset his mother so badly. I could hear Sebastian's voice through the phone, pleading with Jack to apologize to keep the peace, saying Eleanor was devastated and felt attacked. Jack's jaw got tight, and he said very clearly that his mother owed us the apology, that she was the one who'd walked out of a baby shower and threatened to disinherit her granddaughters. Sebastian tried the "she's just disappointed" line again, and Jack interrupted him to say that disappointment didn't excuse cruelty, that being upset didn't give anyone the right to reject children. Sebastian sighed and said he'd try to talk to Eleanor, but Jack said not to bother unless the conversation involved Eleanor apologizing and changing her behavior. They hung up and Jack looked exhausted, like standing up to his parents had taken everything he had. 3 weeks passed before my next doctor's appointment, and I spent most of that time trying not to think about Eleanor's email or the will threat. At 7 months pregnant, I was supposed to be focused on preparing for Rose's arrival, not dealing with my mother-in-law's rejection of both my daughters. The appointment started normally with the usual measurements and questions, but then the nurse took my blood pressure twice and asked me to wait while she got the doctor. My doctor came in looking concerned and told me my blood pressure was higher than she liked to see at this stage. She asked about stress levels, and I tried to brush it off, but then I just broke down crying right there on the exam table. I told her everything about Eleanor walking out of the shower, the will threat, the email about gender selection, all of it pouring out while I sat there in a paper gown feeling ridiculous. My doctor listened carefully, and then explained that family stress could actually affect the pregnancy, that high blood pressure this late could lead to complications we needed to avoid. She recommended reducing stress where possible and monitoring my blood pressure at home, which felt impossible when Eleanor kept finding new ways to make things worse. I left that appointment scared and angry, scared for Rose's health and angry that Eleanor's behavior was literally affecting my body. 2 days later, Helen called and invited us to her house for a family gathering. She made it clear Eleanor wasn't invited, and that she'd gathered Jack's aunts, uncles, and cousins to talk about the situation. Jack was nervous about it, but I wanted to go, wanted to understand if this was really as bad as it felt or if I was overreacting. We got there Saturday afternoon, and Helen's house was packed with family members, all looking uncomfortable but determined. Helen started by explaining why she'd called everyone together, how Eleanor's behavior at the shower and afterward had crossed serious lines. Then people started sharing their own stories about Eleanor, and I realized this pattern went back years. Jack's uncle talked about how Eleanor had tried to control his wedding plans, demanding certain venues and guest lists. An aunt mentioned how Eleanor had criticized her parenting choices for decades, always implying she knew better. Another cousin shared how Eleanor had refused to attend her college graduation because she'd chosen a major Eleanor didn't approve of. Every story painted the same picture of a woman who needed to control everything and rejected anything that didn't match her exact vision. I sat there listening and feeling this weird mix of validation and sadness. Validation that I wasn't crazy for seeing her behavior as wrong, sadness that Jack had grown up with this and probably thought it was normal. Then Jack's cousin brought up something that made the whole room go quiet. He mentioned that Eleanor had done something similar years ago, when his sister had 3 daughters in a row. Eleanor had made comments about wasted pregnancies and kept asking when they'd try for a boy, got increasingly critical with each girl born. His sister had eventually stopped bringing the girls around Eleanor because the rejection was so obvious, and his parents had cut off contact with Eleanor for 2 full years over it. Jack's face went pale as his cousin talked, and I watched him process this information in real time. He'd been too young to remember the details back then, just knew there'd been some family tension, but hearing it laid out now made everything click. Eleanor's behavior wasn't about our specific daughters or some new fixation. This was a long-standing pattern of valuing male grandchildren over female ones. Jack's hands were shaking, and he excused himself to go outside, and Helen followed him while the rest of us sat in heavy silence. When they came back in, Jack looked like he'd been crying, but also looked more determined than I'd seen him in weeks. He thanked everyone for coming and for sharing their stories, said it helped him understand that protecting our daughters from his mother wasn't overreacting, it was necessary. The gathering broke up around dinner time, and we drove home quiet, both processing everything we'd heard. 3 weeks before my due date, I was in the nursery folding tiny clothes when the doorbell rang. Jack went to answer it, and I heard Eleanor's voice in the hallway, cheerful and casual like nothing had happened. I stayed in the living room, one hand on my belly, listening to her tell Jack she'd brought a gift for us. Through the doorway, I could see her holding out a gift bag decorated with blue ribbons, which felt like a deliberate choice. Jack took the bag and looked inside while Eleanor stood there smiling, clearly expecting gratitude. I watched his expression change from confusion to anger as he read whatever note was in there. He pulled out a book about raising boys and held it up, asking his mother if she was serious. Eleanor launched into an explanation about how it was never too early to start planning for the next pregnancy, how she'd done research on gender selection and found some excellent clinics. The note inside apparently offered to help us afford the procedures, like this was some generous gift instead of another rejection of our daughters. Jack's voice got very quiet and very firm as he handed the bag back to Eleanor. He told her she wasn't welcome in our home until she could treat all her grandchildren with equal love, not just hypothetical grandsons. Eleanor's face went red and she started sputtering about how ungrateful we were, how she was trying to help our family, how we were being dramatic. Jack just stood there holding the door open and repeated that she needed to leave. Eleanor grabbed the bag and stormed down the front steps, yelling back that we'd regret this, that she was done trying to fix our mistakes. Jack closed the door and leaned against it, breathing hard, and I went to him. We stood there in the hallway for a long time, just holding each other, both of us shaking. That night after Lucy was asleep, Jack and I lay in bed and finally let ourselves fall apart. He cried in a way I'd never seen before, deep sobs that shook his whole body. He kept saying he never imagined his mother could be this person, that he felt like he was losing a parent while also realizing he'd never really known her at all. I cried too, for him and for our daughters and for the grandmother relationship that should exist but never would. Jack talked about memories from his childhood that suddenly looked different now. Times he'd thought his mother was just particular or had high standards. But maybe she'd always been this controlling and conditional. He said it felt like mourning someone who was still alive, grieving the mother he'd thought he had while dealing with the reality of who she actually was. We held each other and cried until we were exhausted, and then we just lay there in the dark, talking about how we'd protect Lucy and Rose from ever feeling like they weren't enough. The next morning, Lucy found her big sister dress in the back of her closet and insisted on wearing it. She'd grown since the shower, so it was getting snug, but she wanted it on anyway. She spent the whole day practicing being gentle with her baby dolls, cradling them carefully and singing little songs she made up. She'd hold them up to my belly and tell Rose about being sisters, about how they'd play together and share toys. Watching her excitement about becoming a big sister made Eleanor's rejection hurt even more, because Lucy deserved a grandmother who celebrated both her and Rose. She deserved family members who showed up and loved her without conditions or disappointment. Instead, she had a grandmother who'd walked away because Lucy wasn't a boy, and Rose wouldn't be either. I took pictures of Lucy in her dress holding her baby dolls, wanting to remember this pure excitement before she was old enough to understand that some people didn't value her the way she deserved. My grandmother Caroline called the next afternoon sounding furious. She'd run into Eleanor at the grocery store, and Eleanor had actually approached her, tried to get her to talk sense into me about trying for a boy after Rose was born. Caroline told me she'd responded by pointing out that she'd raised 3 daughters who were all successful and happy adults, that maybe Eleanor should examine her own internalized misogyny instead of projecting it onto her granddaughters. Eleanor had apparently huffed off without buying her groceries, but Caroline wanted me to know about the encounter in case Eleanor tried approaching other family members. I thanked her and felt grateful that at least some grandparents in this family understood that daughters were just as valuable as sons. Caroline reminded me that she'd been one of 3 girls herself, that her own mother had never once wished for boys, and that Eleanor's attitude was backwards and harmful. She told me to focus on staying healthy for Rose's arrival, and not to waste energy on Eleanor's nonsense. Helen called 2 days later with an update on the family situation. She said Eleanor had been uninvited from several upcoming family events because people were uncomfortable with her behavior after hearing the stories at the gathering. Eleanor was playing the victim according to Helen, telling people we'd turned the family against her and she'd done nothing wrong. Helen said most people weren't buying it though, that the shower incident had been too public and too shocking for Eleanor to rewrite the narrative. People had seen her walk out over pink cake, had heard her call our daughters redundancy, and no amount of victim playing could erase those facts. Helen mentioned that even some of Eleanor's church friends were distancing themselves after hearing about the gender selection gift, that Prudence had apparently told other church members it crossed a serious line. I felt relieved that the truth was getting out there, that Eleanor couldn't just spin this into a story where she was the wronged party. Sebastian called Jack privately that evening, and Jack put it on speaker so I could hear. Sebastian sounded exhausted as he admitted that Eleanor had always had strong preferences about gender, but he'd thought she'd come around once the babies actually arrived. He said he'd been wrong to minimize it, wrong to ask Jack to keep the peace, wrong to think love would override Eleanor's fixation on having a grandson. Sebastian explained that he'd tried talking to Eleanor multiple times, but she wouldn't listen to anyone, just doubled down on her position that boys mattered more than girls. He apologized for not standing up to her sooner, for letting her behavior go unchecked for so long. Jack asked his dad why he'd stayed with someone who thought this way, and Sebastian got quiet for a long moment before saying he'd been asking himself the same question lately. They talked for almost an hour about Eleanor's patterns and Sebastian's regrets, and when they hung up, Jack looked drained but also lighter somehow, like his father's honesty had lifted some burden he'd been carrying. 3 days before my due date, I woke up at 2 in the morning with contractions that felt different from the practice ones I'd been having for weeks. These squeezed hard and wouldn't stop. Jack woke up when I grabbed his arm during a particularly strong one, and he was on his feet immediately, timing them on his phone. 15 minutes later, we were sure this was real labor, and he started making calls while I focused on breathing through the pain. He called my mom first, then his dad. I heard Sebastian's sleepy voice ask if they should come to the hospital, and Jack's response was quick and firm. He said only if Eleanor could behave appropriately, which Sebastian admitted wasn't possible right now. Jack thanked him and hung up, then helped me to the car while Lucy slept peacefully in her room. My mom arrived at our house within 20 minutes to stay with Lucy, hugging me carefully before we left. The drive to the hospital felt endless even though it only took 12 minutes. Every bump in the road sent another wave of pain through me, and Jack kept apologizing even though he wasn't driving badly. We checked in at the labor and delivery desk at 3:15 in the morning, and they got me into a room quickly because I was already 6 centimeters along. The nurses were efficient and kind, asking questions while hooking me up to monitors and checking the baby's position. Jack held my hand through every contraction, and I could see the worry in his eyes even though he kept saying everything would be fine. Rose came into the world at 6:47 in the morning after 4 hours of hard labor that felt like days. She weighed 7 pounds and 2 ounces, had a full head of dark hair that stuck up in every direction, and her nose was exactly like Lucy's tiny button nose. The delivery room erupted in congratulations, and someone placed her on my chest while she cried her first cries. Jack was crying too, kissing my forehead and staring at our daughter like she was the most amazing thing he'd ever seen. The nurse cleaned her up a bit while she stayed on my chest, and I couldn't stop looking at her perfect little face. Within 2 hours, my mom showed up with tears streaming down her face, followed by Caroline, who brought flowers, then Amy, who immediately started taking photos, and finally Helen, who kept saying she was absolutely beautiful. They took turns holding Rose while I rested, and Jack sent photos to everyone in the family. The room filled with their voices and laughter and love for this tiny new person. Nobody mentioned Eleanor's absence, but I felt it like a cold spot in an otherwise warm room. Lucy came to meet her sister that afternoon when Jack brought her to the hospital. My mom had dressed her in the big sister dress from the shower, and Lucy walked into the room looking nervous and excited at the same time. She climbed carefully onto the bed next to me, and I helped her hold Rose for the first time. Lucy was so gentle, stroking Rose's tiny hand with one finger, and whispering to her about all the things they would do together. Then she started singing a song she'd made up about having a sister, something about sharing toys and playing dress-up and always being friends. Jack pulled out his phone and recorded the whole thing, and I watched him wipe away tears while he filmed his daughters together. Lucy kissed Rose's forehead very softly and said she would protect her forever, which made me cry all over again. She stayed for an hour, asking questions about the baby and wanting to help with everything, before my mom took her home for dinner and bedtime. After they left, Jack and I just sat there holding Rose and feeling grateful for our family of 4. The hospital room kept filling with flowers and balloons over the next 2 days. Friends from work sent arrangements, neighbors dropped off cards, extended family members sent gifts. There were pink balloons everywhere and stuffed animals piled on the counter and cards covering every surface. But nothing arrived from Eleanor. No flowers, no card, no phone call, nothing. Sebastian sent a text on the second day saying she was beautiful and congratulations, but Jack noticed immediately that the photo Sebastian sent was the same one Jack had posted on social media the day Rose was born. Sebastian hadn't been at the hospital, hadn't met his granddaughter, had just pulled the photo from the internet. Jack showed me the text, and I watched his face fall as he realized his dad was too afraid of Eleanor to even come see Rose in person. He texted back a simple thank you and didn't mention the social media thing, but I could tell it hurt him deeply. We brought Rose home 3 days after her birth and spent the next 72 hours in a happy, exhausted fog of feeding and diaper changes and trying to help Lucy adjust to having a baby in the house. Lucy wanted to help with everything and kept bringing Rose her stuffed animals to keep her company. Jack and I were running on maybe 3 hours of sleep total when the doorbell rang on that 3rd day home. I was feeding Rose in the nursery while Jack answered the door. He came back holding a large envelope that required a signature and had a law firm's return address printed in the corner. My stomach dropped even before he opened it because I knew exactly what it would be. Jack sat down on the couch and pulled out the papers inside, his face going completely pale as he read. It was a formal notice from Eleanor's attorney stating that she had amended her will to remove Lucy and Rose as beneficiaries. All of her assets would now go to Jack's cousin's sons, the boys who could apparently carry on the family name properly. The letter was cold and legal and final, listing both of our daughters by name in the section about removed heirs. Jack pulled out his phone and called his mother immediately. I heard it ring 3 times before she answered, and her voice came through the speaker sounding pleased with herself. She actually sounded happy as she explained that her estate would go to real heirs who could carry on the family name the way it was meant to be carried on. Jack's hand shook as he held the phone, and I watched him try to form words that wouldn't come at first. Finally, he asked her if she understood what she was doing, if she realized she was punishing two innocent little girls, but Eleanor just kept talking about legacy and family lines and practical decisions. I sat in the nursery feeding Rose while listening to the conversation escalate in the living room. Jack's voice got louder and louder until he was shouting into the phone that his mother was sick and twisted. He told her she wasn't punishing us. She was punishing two innocent little girls who never did anything except have the audacity to be born female. His voice cracked on that last word, and I heard the pain mixed with the anger. Eleanor's response came through clear enough for me to hear from the nursery. She said she was simply being practical about her legacy, and if we chose to have a son later, she would reconsider the whole thing. Jack cut her off before she could say more, his voice going cold and final in a way I'd never heard before. He told her there wouldn't be a later, that she was dead to us now, and he hung up before she could respond. Then I heard him throw his phone across the room and the sound of it hitting the wall. Rose had finished eating, so I burped her gently and carried her out to the living room where Jack sat on the couch with his head in his hands. I sat down next to him with Rose in my arms, and we didn't say anything for a long time. Lucy was napping in her room, and the house was quiet, except for Rose's little breathing sounds. That night, after both girls were asleep, Jack and I finally talked about the will situation. We sat at the kitchen table with cold coffee neither of us was drinking and went through everything that had happened. I told him I didn't care about Eleanor's money, that I cared about protecting our daughters from someone who saw them as disappointments. The money meant nothing compared to keeping Lucy and Rose safe from that kind of rejection and toxicity. Jack agreed immediately and said his mother's money wasn't worth exposing our girls to her poison. He said he'd rather have nothing and raise daughters who knew they were valued than have Eleanor's estate and let her treat them like they were worthless. We talked about boundaries and what contact would look like going forward, and decided that unless Eleanor genuinely changed and apologized, she wouldn't be part of our lives or our daughters' lives. It felt good to be on the same page, even though the whole situation made us both sad and angry. Amy came over the next day and found me crying while Rose slept in my arms on the couch. I'd been holding it together pretty well, but something about my sister walking through the door made everything spill out. I told her about the certified letter and Eleanor's triumphant phone call, and the will amendment removing both girls. Amy's face went red and she started pacing around the living room saying she wanted to drive to Eleanor's house right now and tell her exactly what kind of person she was. She was so angry she was shaking and kept asking how anyone could do this to their own grandchildren. I asked her not to go, told her Eleanor wasn't worth the energy or the confrontation. Amy sat down next to me and put her arm around my shoulders while I cried into Rose's soft hair. She said Eleanor was showing everyone who she really was, and someday she'd regret losing these beautiful girls, but by then it would be too late because we'd have moved on without her. The next day, Helen called while I was changing Rose's diaper. Jack answered and I heard him say Helen's name. Then his voice got louder as he moved toward the nursery. He held out the phone and I could hear Helen talking before I even took it from him. She was so angry her words came out fast and clipped, saying Sebastian had told her about the will amendment, and this crossed every line even for Eleanor. She said she was done making excuses for her sister, and she was organizing the extended family to write a collective letter expressing their disappointment in Eleanor's behavior. I told her we appreciated it, but she didn't need to do that, and Helen cut me off saying yes she did, because Eleanor needed to hear from everyone that her actions were wrong and hurtful. She said she'd already talked to 5 family members, and they were all on board. After we hung up, Jack sat on the floor next to the changing table and watched me finish with Rose's diaper. He looked tired in a way sleep couldn't fix. 2 weeks after Rose was born, the hormones hit me like a truck. I'd be feeding Rose and suddenly start crying for no reason, or I'd be playing with Lucy and feel this wave of sadness wash over me. Eleanor's rejection kept playing in my mind on repeat, her voice saying my daughters were redundancy and not real grandchildren. I couldn't shake it no matter how much I tried to focus on the good things. At my postpartum checkup, the doctor asked how I was doing, and I broke down right there in the exam room. I told her about Eleanor and the will and how I couldn't stop thinking about it even though I knew it was crazy. She listened and then said postpartum anxiety was common and nothing to be ashamed of. She wrote a prescription for medication and gave me a referral to a therapist who specialized in family estrangement issues. I made the appointment before I left the office because I knew if I waited, I'd talk myself out of it. The therapist's office was in a small building near the hospital. I went alone the first time, leaving both girls with my mom, Octavia. The therapist was older with gray hair and kind eyes, and she didn't waste time with small talk. She asked me to tell her what brought me in, and I explained the whole situation from the baby shower to the will amendment. When I finished, she nodded like she'd heard similar stories before. She said Eleanor's behavior was about her own issues, not about my daughter's worth. She explained that some grandparents have rigid expectations about their grandchildren, and when reality doesn't match their fantasy, they reject the actual grandchildren in favor of imaginary perfect ones they'll never have. She said Eleanor had built up this idea of a grandson so completely that she couldn't accept anything else, and that was a reflection of Eleanor's limitations, not my daughter's value. Hearing someone outside the family say it helped more than I expected. Lucy started asking about Eleanor more often around this time. She'd see Octavia come over and say she wanted Grandma Eleanor too. One morning while I was making breakfast, Lucy asked why Grandma Eleanor didn't visit like Grandma Octavia did. Jack and I had practiced this conversation with the therapist, working on age-appropriate explanations. I knelt down next to Lucy and told her that sometimes people make choices that hurt others, and Grandma Eleanor made some choices that hurt our feelings. I said it wasn't Lucy's fault or Rose's fault, that they were both perfect and loved. Lucy thought about this for a minute and then asked if Grandma Eleanor didn't like girls. Jack's face went pale, but I kept my voice steady and said some people have trouble loving people who are different from what they expected, but that was Grandma Eleanor's problem to work on, not ours. Lucy nodded and went back to her cereal, and I hoped we'd said enough without saying too much. A month after Rose's birth, Helen called to say the letter was ready. 15 family members had signed it, including Jack's aunts, uncles, and several cousins. Helen read parts of it to me over the phone. It detailed specific examples of Eleanor's hurtful behavior, starting with the baby shower exit and ending with the will amendment. It said that unless Eleanor sought professional help and made genuine amends, she wouldn't be welcome at future family gatherings. The letter was firm but not cruel, laying out facts and consequences. Helen planned to mail it certified so Eleanor couldn't claim she never received it. Jack signed it too after reading the whole thing twice. He said it felt right to have the family stand together against his mother's toxicity. Eleanor's response came 3 days later in the form of a group email sent to the entire extended family. Jack's phone dinged with the notification, and his face changed as he read it. He handed me the phone without saying anything. Eleanor had written a long message claiming she was the victim of a conspiracy led by me. She said I'd manipulated Jack and poisoned the family against her because I was threatened by strong women. She called the letter an attack and said she'd done nothing wrong by being honest about her disappointment. She claimed she had every right to leave her estate to whoever she chose, and the family had no business interfering in her financial decisions. The email was so delusional it would have been funny if it wasn't about my daughters. She actually wrote that she was the one being rejected and discriminated against for having traditional values about family legacy. Helen responded to the group email within an hour. I watched the new message come through on Jack's phone and opened it immediately. Helen had attached screenshots of Eleanor's texts about real grandchildren and redundancy, plus written testimony from 3 country club staff members who had witnessed the baby shower exit. She'd included the dates and times of everything, building a timeline of Eleanor's behavior. Several family members who'd been quiet before replied to Helen's email expressing shock at seeing the evidence in writing. Jack's cousin wrote that he had no idea it was this bad. Another aunt said she was horrified and fully supported the boundaries in the letter. Watching the family rally around us made something tight in my chest finally loosen. Sebastian called Jack 2 days after the email exchange. I was in the kitchen and heard Jack answer, then heard his voice change from normal to concerned. He walked into the living room where I was folding laundry and put the call on speaker. Sebastian sounded broken, his voice rough like he'd been crying. He said he was moving into our guest room because he couldn't handle Eleanor's obsession anymore. Jack started to protest, but Sebastian cut him off and explained that Eleanor had turned their house into a shrine to the grandson she'd never have. She'd bought boy clothes in various sizes and filled a closet with them. She'd purchased toys and books meant for boys and arranged them in the spare bedroom. She talked to the empty room sometimes, Sebastian said, like the imaginary grandson was already there. She kept saying Jack and I would come to our senses eventually. Sebastian said he'd tried everything, tried reasoning with her and suggesting counseling, but she refused to admit anything was wrong. He said he loved her, but he couldn't live in that house anymore, couldn't watch her reject his actual granddaughters while obsessing over a fantasy. Jack told him to come over whenever he needed to. My grandmother Caroline invited us to Sunday dinner the following week. She'd made pot roast and homemade rolls, and the whole house smelled amazing when we arrived. Lucy ran straight to Caroline for a hug while I carried Rose in her car seat. We sat around the dining room table, and before we started eating, Caroline stood up with her wine glass. She said she wanted to make a toast to her 2 beautiful great-granddaughters who were perfect exactly as they were. She looked right at Lucy when she said it, and Lucy beamed with pride. Even tiny Rose seemed to smile, though it was probably just gas. Caroline went on to say that any grandmother who couldn't see the value in these girls was missing out on something precious, and that was Eleanor's loss, not ours. I felt the weight of Eleanor's rejection lift slightly, replaced by the warmth of being surrounded by people who actually loved my daughters for who they were. Jack started therapy the week after Sebastian moved in. He'd been holding everything together for me and the girls, but I could see the toll it was taking. His therapist worked with him on the grief of losing his mother to her own rigidity. Jack came home from his second session and told me what the therapist had said, that he couldn't fix or change Eleanor. He could only control his own responses and protect his children from her harmful messages. The therapist explained that Jack was mourning 2 losses, the mother he thought he had, and the grandmother his daughters deserved. Jack cried while he told me this, sitting at the kitchen table with his head in his hands. I held him and let him cry, knowing he needed to feel it all before he could move forward. 2 months after Rose was born, a card arrived in the mail addressed to Jack. I was in the kitchen feeding Rose when he opened it and his whole body went stiff. The card had a generic birthday message inside with Eleanor's handwriting below it. Jack read it out loud, his voice flat and angry. She wrote that she'd been thinking about our situation and was willing to reconsider everything if we agreed to try for a boy within the year. She included a list of fertility clinics that offered gender selection and circled one she'd already contacted on our behalf. Jack stood there staring at the card for a long moment, and then he did something I'd never seen him do before. He tore the card into pieces, methodical and deliberate, ripping it smaller and smaller until it was confetti in his hands. He threw the pieces in the trash and pulled out his phone. I watched him scroll to Eleanor's contact and hit the block button without saying a word. Then he blocked her on every other platform he could think of. Social media, email, everything. When he finished, he looked at me and said she was done. She'd made her choice, and now he was making his. Lucy started preschool that fall and came home excited every day with new art projects and stories about her friends. The Mother's Day craft project had her buzzing with energy because she got to make cards for all the special women in her life. She made one for me with pink hearts, and her handwriting spelling out Mom in wobbly letters. She made one for Octavia with flowers she'd painted herself. She made one for Caroline with a drawing of the two of them holding hands. Her teacher asked if she wanted to make one for any other grandmothers, and Lucy thought about it seriously. Then she said very matter-of-fact that Grandma Eleanor doesn't like girls, so she doesn't visit them. I got a call from the teacher that afternoon asking if she could speak with me. My stomach dropped because I knew exactly what Lucy had said. The next morning, I went in early for pickup, and the teacher pulled me aside into the hallway. She had kind eyes, but looked concerned as she explained what Lucy had told her. She said she wanted to understand the situation because she was worried about the message Lucy might be getting about her own value. I explained everything, keeping my voice steady even though talking about it still hurt. The teacher listened and nodded, and when I finished, she reached out and squeezed my hand. She told me she'd make sure Lucy knew she was valued and special regardless of her gender. She said she'd reinforce that message every day if needed because every child deserved to know they mattered. Helen called me a week later with an invitation to what she was calling a celebration of daughters party. She'd invited all the women in the family and their daughters for an afternoon at her house. When we arrived, the living room was full of aunts and cousins and little girls running around playing. Helen had set up a photo display showing strong women throughout our family history. There was Caroline's mother who'd run her own business in the 1940s. There was Helen's grandmother who'd been a teacher when women rarely worked outside the home. There was aunt after aunt who'd done amazing things with their lives. Helen gathered everyone together and started sharing stories about these women and their achievements. She talked about how every generation of daughters had built on what came before. Then she looked directly at me, holding Rose with Lucy pressed against my side. She said it was a shame that Eleanor had forgotten she came from a line of strong women, that Eleanor's own mother would be ashamed of her daughter's attitude toward granddaughters. The room got quiet for a moment, and then Caroline stood up. She raised her glass and said, "Here's to daughters and granddaughters and all the women who knew their worth." Everyone cheered, and Lucy beamed with pride. Sebastian called Jack 2 days after the party. His voice sounded different, harder somehow and more decided. He told Jack he'd filed for separation from Eleanor that morning. 35 years of marriage couldn't compete with her obsession anymore, and he was choosing his own peace over enabling her delusions. He'd tried everything, he said. Tried reasoning and suggesting counseling and begging her to see what she was doing to the family. But Eleanor refused to admit anything was wrong. She kept insisting she was the reasonable one and everyone else was overreacting. Sebastian said he couldn't watch her reject his actual granddaughters while obsessing over a fantasy anymore. He was moving into his own apartment and he wanted Jack to know it wasn't about picking sides, it was about his own mental health. Eleanor didn't take the separation quietly. She called every member of Sebastian's family claiming he was abandoning her in her time of need. She painted herself as the victim of a conspiracy led by me and enabled by her ungrateful son. But Sebastian had prepared for this. He showed his family the evidence, screenshots of her texts about real grandchildren and redundancy, photos of the nursery she'd set up for the imaginary grandson, recordings of her voicemails demanding we try for a boy. Most of Sebastian's family sided with him after seeing the proof. His brother called Eleanor directly and told her she needed professional help. His sister stopped returning her calls entirely. 3 months after Rose was born, I woke up one morning and realized I felt like myself again. The fog of postpartum hormones had lifted and my body felt stronger. Rose was sleeping in longer stretches, and Lucy was thriving in preschool with new friends and new confidence. Our little family of 4 had found a rhythm that worked without Eleanor's drama weighing us down. I looked at Jack making breakfast while Lucy chattered about her day, and Rose gurgled in her bouncer and felt something settle in my chest. We were actually happier without Eleanor. The house felt lighter, the days felt easier, and nobody was waiting for the other shoe to drop. Jack came home from therapy one afternoon looking different. Lighter somehow, like he'd set down something heavy he'd been carrying. He sat down at the kitchen table and told me what his therapist had said. That his mother had chosen her fantasy grandson over her real granddaughters, and that choice reflected her character, not his daughter's worth. The therapist had helped him see that he'd been carrying guilt that wasn't his to carry, trying to fix something that was never his to fix. Jack said he'd spent so long trying to be the bridge between his mother and his family, but you can't build a bridge to someone who refuses to meet you halfway." He looked at me with clear eyes and said he was done trying. Amy called me squealing with excitement because her boyfriend had proposed. She was engaged and already planning the wedding, and she had something important to tell us. Eleanor wasn't invited. Amy said it very firmly, no room for negotiation. She wouldn't have someone at her celebration who thought women were redundancy, and her fiancé completely agreed. They were building their marriage on mutual respect and equality, and Eleanor represented everything they were rejecting. I felt proud of my sister for standing firm, even though I knew it would cause drama. Eleanor somehow heard about the wedding exclusion within days. She sent Amy a long, nasty message about family loyalty and tradition, and how Amy was making a huge mistake. The message was full of guilt trips and manipulation, and thinly veiled threats about being cut off from family events. Amy read it, took a deep breath, and responded with one single sentence. "You walked out on a baby shower because of pink cake. You don't get to lecture anyone about family." Then she blocked Eleanor's number just like Jack had done. 4 months after Rose was born, I booked a photographer for family pictures. We all dressed in coordinating blues and whites and headed to the park near our house. Lucy wore a little sundress and kept spinning to make it twirl. Rose was in a tiny outfit with ruffles. Jack looked relaxed in a way I hadn't seen in months. The photographer had us sit on a blanket under a big oak tree. She took shots of all 4 of us together, then just the girls, then me with both daughters. Lucy kept leaning over to kiss Rose's head between poses. The photographer caught one of those moments perfectly. Lucy's little face pressed against Rose's fuzzy hair, her eyes closed, pure love radiating from every part of her. When I saw that photo on the preview screen, I knew immediately it was going in our living room. We ordered an 11 by 14 print, and I found the perfect frame for it, hung it right above the couch where everyone could see it when they walked in. Every time I looked at that photo, I felt this warmth spread through my chest. My 2 girls who Eleanor thought weren't worth celebrating. My daughters who were everything. Helen asked for a copy of the photo a week later. She had it printed in the same size and framed it for her house too. Then she sent another copy to Sebastian at his new apartment. She called me after he received it, and her voice was thick with emotion. Sebastian had cried when he opened the package. He called Helen immediately and told her how beautiful his granddaughters were, how lucky they were to have parents who loved them so completely, how sad he felt that Eleanor was missing all of this. Helen said he kept the photo on his kitchen counter where he could see it every morning during breakfast. He'd told her that looking at Lucy kissing Rose reminded him what family was supposed to be about. Not legacy or names or gender, just love, pure and simple. Helen said Sebastian was building a whole collection of photos of the girls on his fridge now. Every picture we sent him went up immediately. 2 weeks later, Helen ran into Prudence Chase at the grocery store. Prudence was one of Eleanor's church friends from the ladies' group. Helen told me Prudence had approached her in the produce section looking uncomfortable. She'd asked Helen if she had a minute to talk about Eleanor. They stood by the apples while Prudence admitted that many people at church were having trouble with Eleanor's attitude lately. Eleanor had been complaining loudly about having granddaughters instead of grandsons. She'd told multiple people that girls were redundancy and boys were legacy. Prudence said several church members had started questioning Eleanor's character after hearing these comments. The pastor's wife had pulled Prudence aside and asked if Eleanor needed counseling. Some of the older women in the congregation had stopped sitting with Eleanor during services. Prudence said she felt guilty for not speaking up sooner, but Eleanor's views about gender were making everyone deeply uncomfortable. Helen thanked Prudence for being honest and told her that Eleanor had walked out of a baby shower over pink cake. Prudence's face went pale. She said she hadn't known it was that bad. Lucy's preschool announced a special Person's Day, where kids could invite any important adult to come read stories to the class. Lucy didn't hesitate. She chose Caroline. My grandmother cleared her entire schedule and showed up at the preschool wearing her favorite cardigan with her reading glasses on a chain around her neck. She brought 3 of Lucy's favorite books and settled into the reading chair like she'd been doing this her whole life. I stood in the doorway watching Caroline read to the class with Lucy sitting right at her feet gazing up at her. The other kids were captivated too. Caroline did all the voices and made the stories come alive. After the reading, Lucy gave Caroline a tour of the classroom showing her all the artwork and the play kitchen and the book corner. Caroline praised everything Lucy showed her. On the drive home, Lucy talked nonstop about how great-grandma Caroline was the best reader in the whole world. I felt this overwhelming gratitude that Lucy had grandmothers who actually showed up for her, who celebrated her, who made her feel valued just for being herself. 5 months after having Rose, I woke up one morning and realized I felt like myself again. The postpartum fog had lifted completely. My body felt strong. Rose was giggling now and reaching for toys with her chubby little hands. Lucy was learning her letters at preschool and coming home singing the alphabet song. Jack and I had found our rhythm as a family of 4. We'd figured out bedtimes and mealtimes and how to get everyone out the door in the morning. Eleanor's absence had created this space in our lives. Room for healthier relationships to grow. Room for us to breathe without constantly worrying about her next criticism or demand. We were actually happier without her drama. The house felt lighter. Days felt easier. Nobody was waiting for the other shoe to drop or walking on eggshells. We'd built something good here, something Eleanor couldn't touch or ruin. Sebastian made it official and signed a lease on an apartment across town. He called Jack to let him know he'd moved out completely. The separation from Eleanor was real now, not just temporary or a trial. Sebastian started coming over every Sunday afternoon. He'd arrive with little gifts for the girls, books for Lucy, soft toys for Rose. He'd sit on the floor and play with Lucy while I fed Rose. He'd hold Rose and make silly faces until she giggled. He told Jack one Sunday that he regretted not standing up to Eleanor sooner, that he'd wasted months trying to keep the peace instead of protecting his granddaughters. But he was determined now to be the grandfather our girls deserved. Lucy started calling him Grandpa Sebastian and asking when he was coming to visit next. Watching him build real relationships with both girls made me wish he'd done this earlier. But I was grateful he was doing it now. Then Eleanor made one final attempt at getting to us. A letter arrived in the mail with her return address. Inside was a long note about how she'd been diagnosed with a serious health condition. She said the doctors weren't sure how much time she had left. She wanted to reconcile with Jack before it was too late. She wanted to meet her granddaughters while she still could. The letter was full of emotional language about regrets and second chances, and not wanting to die estranged from her only son. Jack read it twice, then immediately called Sebastian. He asked his dad point blank if Eleanor was sick. Sebastian sighed heavily and said no. There was no diagnosis. Eleanor was perfectly healthy. She'd made the whole thing up hoping to guilt Jack into contact. Jack's hand was shaking when he hung up the phone. He looked at me with this mix of anger and hurt and said he couldn't believe his mother would lie about something like that. Would fake a terminal illness just to manipulate him. Jack sat down that night after the girls were asleep and wrote Eleanor a final letter. He wrote for over an hour. When he finished, he read it out loud to me. He'd laid out everything, her lies, her manipulation, her rejection of his daughters. He wrote that she'd destroyed their relationship beyond any possible repair, that her actions had shown him exactly who she was. He told her that if she ever genuinely changed and got professional help, he'd consider supervised contact with the girls. But until then, she needed to leave all of us alone. He said any future attempts to contact us would be ignored. He mailed the letter the next morning. We never heard back from Eleanor. But Jack said writing that letter felt like closing a door that needed to be closed, setting a boundary that should have been set months ago. Amy's wedding happened 6 months after Rose was born, and it was perfect. The ceremony was outdoors at a vineyard with string lights and flowers everywhere. Lucy was the flower girl in a white dress with a pink sash. She took her job so seriously, walking down the aisle, dropping petals. Rose slept through the entire ceremony in my arms, wrapped in a soft blanket. The vows were beautiful. Amy and her husband wrote their own and talked about building a marriage based on respect and equality, about raising any future children to know their worth regardless of gender. Several relatives glanced at me during that part, knowing exactly what Amy was referencing. The reception was in a big tent with a dance floor and a live band. Everyone seemed more relaxed than usual at family events. Jack's aunt mentioned how nice it was not to worry about Eleanor causing a scene. His cousin said the whole vibe felt lighter without her presence. People actually enjoyed themselves instead of managing Eleanor's mood. At the reception, Caroline stood up to give a speech. She talked about the strength of the women in our family, about how she'd raised 3 daughters who'd grown up to raise their own daughters, about how each generation had fought to make sure the next one knew their worth. She talked about women who'd broken barriers and challenged expectations, about mothers who'd taught their daughters to be proud of who they were. She never mentioned Eleanor by name, but everyone in that tent knew exactly who she was talking about. Caroline looked right at me while she spoke, then at Lucy, who was dancing with Jack, then at Rose sleeping in Amy's arms. She raised her glass and said she was proud of every woman in this family. Proud of the mothers raising daughters to be strong and confident, proud of the grandmothers who showed up and celebrated their granddaughters. The whole tent erupted in applause. Several people were wiping their eyes. Jack squeezed my hand under the table. Amy was beaming, and I felt this sense of belonging, of being part of something bigger than just my little family. We were all connected by this determination to lift each other up, to make sure no girl in our family ever questioned her value again. 7 months after Rose's birth, Sebastian came over for his regular Sunday visit, and Lucy ran straight to him with her arms up. He scooped her into a hug, and she pressed her face against his shoulder. I was in the kitchen making lunch when I heard her say it. Her little voice carried through the house. She told Sebastian she was happy he visited now because he liked girls. Sebastian's eyes filled up, and he looked at me over Lucy's head. He set her down gently and told her he loved girls very much, especially his 2 granddaughters. Lucy beamed and grabbed his hand to show him the picture she'd drawn. I stood there holding a dish towel, feeling this mix of gratitude and sadness. Gratitude that Sebastian showed up consistently, that Lucy noticed and valued his presence. Sadness that she'd already learned at 3 years old to recognize who actually wanted her around. She'd processed Eleanor's absence and Sebastian's presence, and drawn her own conclusions about who deserved her affection. That night after the girls went to sleep, Jack and I sat on the couch with glasses of wine. We'd been talking about expanding our family, not because we wanted a boy, not to prove anything to Eleanor, but because we genuinely loved being parents and wanted more kids. Jack said he'd been thinking about it for weeks and wanted to make sure I was ready after everything with his mother. I told him I was ready, that I wanted our daughters to have more siblings if we were blessed with them. We talked about timing, about waiting until Rose was a bit older, maybe trying in a year or two. Jack brought up Eleanor and I stopped him. I said if she ever asked about our family planning, which she probably would if she heard through the family grapevine, we'd tell her it was none of her business. She'd given up the right to know anything about our decisions when she walked out of that baby shower. Jack agreed and said he felt lighter knowing we were making this choice for ourselves, not in reaction to his mother's demands. The next Sunday, Sebastian came over again and brought groceries for us. While Jack grilled outside with the girls playing in the yard, Sebastian and I talked in the kitchen. He mentioned that Eleanor had started going to a different church. I asked why, and he said too many people at her old church had questioned how she treated us. Apparently, several members had asked her directly about the baby shower incident, and she couldn't handle the judgment. Sebastian said she was telling people at the new church a completely different story where she was the wronged party, where we'd kept her grandchildren from her for no reason. He looked tired when he said it. He told me he'd stopped trying to correct her narrative because it was pointless. She'd rewritten history in her mind, and no amount of facts would change it. I thanked him for being honest with us and for showing up for the girls. He said it was the easiest decision he'd ever made. That evening, I rocked Rose to sleep in the nursery while Jack read to Lucy in her room. I could hear his voice through the wall, doing different character voices that made Lucy giggle. Rose's breathing slowed and her little fist unclenched from my shirt. I looked down at her perfect face and then over at the doorway where I could see Jack and Lucy curled up together with her favorite book. We'd built exactly the family we wanted. Eleanor's rejection had hurt deeply, had left scars that probably wouldn't fully heal, but it had also freed us from her toxic expectations. My daughters would grow up knowing they were valued for who they were, not what gender they happened to be born. They'd never question whether they were real or enough. We'd chosen love over legacy, and our family was stronger for it.